they mostly know you from you had a very famous challenge of trying to learn Japanese in a very short period of time. And so can you share like some background about that challenge and maybe like share like what worked for that challenge and what didn't work?
Absolutely, yeah. And I have successful and unsuccessful projects all the time. And Japanese was among my less successful projects, but I did at least in the 2 months, and people are welcome to see that I put my money where my mouth is, and I, from day one, would speak. And you can see videos of me sharing my conversations on Skype at the start. They're cringeworthy if you speak Japanese very well, but if you're an absolute beginner, then you see somebody try to speak that language. And I'm very proud of the fact that I did, in those 2 months, push my Japanese to at least that basic conversational level. And like that was by simply speaking it all the time. And I had to make a few adjustments. So when it comes to both Chinese and Japanese, because I know that reading is not going to be central to my initial project of speaking, this means that learning kanji, or in the case of Chinese, learning Hanzi, this is not a priority for me. And so I said that from the absolute start, that all the vocabulary that I was putting into my flashcard decks, those were going to be presented in hiragana, katakana only. So I'd learned those because they're not that hard to learn in a short amount of time, but I only need the phonetic equivalent sounds of the language because I don't plan to read it right now. Doesn't mean I'll never plan to read it, but to be practical, if you have a spoken focus, that's what you need to make of it. So at the 2 month point, I reached that stage where I could have basic conversations with a patient speaker. Definitely not fluent, because like I said before, fluent levels, they need to be able to talk naturally to you. And the mistakes I made in that project, I think part of them were personal life challenges that I had, but in general, I didn't really have a good idea of what I was going to do in Japan. So I did end up going to Japan, but it was mostly just a touristy trip. I didn't have a truly full level of immersion that I feel like I've had in so many other countries. So the big, and I'm sure so many of your guests say this, the big why of the reason behind what you're doing this needs to be there. And for me, a big why, a big motivating factor in a lot of my projects is I'm going to go to that country, spend considerable time there, and I'm going to make friends in that country. At the time, I was traveling with an English-speaking partner, and that completely changed my dynamic as I was going to go to the country, that I knew I was going to spend more time with her and not necessarily immersing myself in the culture. So that kind of took a lot of that pressure that I need to be there off me. So that's part of the problem. But ultimately, like people would always say, well, you know, Asian languages in particular are going to be harder, and absolutely, there's no doubt about it. There's less common vocabulary and so on. But for me, this whole concept, I consider it to be useless. It's nothing more than mental masturbation, just deciding, do you know what? My language is the hardest language. And it's more of an ego thing. It's like, I've learned Japanese, you haven't, and I put this work in, and I want you to know how hard Japanese is because of that. But the thing is, I've heard this line over and over again. I've heard Hungarian is the hardest language, French is the hardest language, Arabic is the hardest language, Chinese is the hardest language, Japanese is I've just every single time. And it all comes from a place of ego and pride. It's not like I wrote this very detailed article where I was trying to address concerns someone had about why Chinese is the hardest language in the world. And the guy who wrote the article had not actually ever truly learned any other language. So he was making this bold assumption without any experience of other languages. And the thing is, learning languages is difficult. It definitely has that aspect of adjusting to like these brand new sounds. I have to understand what they mean, and I have to try to produce sounds myself. That is an adjustment. But because of that, like, I wouldn't have said that like Japanese in particular had aspects of the language that slowed me down from getting into that beginning speaking stage. obviously there's advanced aspects of Japanese that I don't know anything about, that I can't speak to, but it definitely did not fit an exception to the rule of speak from day one. And I'm pretty happy with that basic conversational level I reached in 2 months, because so many people will put years into learning a language like Japanese and not get to that level. And I did not get to that level because I'm smarter than them. I really emphasize this to people. I do not have any innate language talent. I just embrace sounding like an idiot, and I'm okay with that, and that helps me push through it. And because of that, I got to that stage, and I definitely plan to I'm back into a mode right now where I can travel solo again, and I definitely plan to return to Japanese at some stage. I'll share that project with people when it comes around to it. I'll try and aim high, and do you know what? Maybe I failed, but the thing is, if you aim as high as possible and really push yourself, that's how you know you're going to drive yourself forward. I feel too many people have very vague ideas of, you know, like New Year's is coming around and people will say, I'm making a New Year's resolution, I want to speak Japanese. And that doesn't mean anything. Like, what you need to have your basic smart objectives, you know, specific, measurable, all those things. And that's where my concept of fluent in 3 months comes from, is I know what fluency means. I know what 3 months means. I have these very specific ideas in mind. I'm going to push myself as much as possible. If I fall short of that, it was intentionally as ambitious as possible, so that falling short of it still lands me somewhere very useful to be